The most destabilizing pain is not the pain that makes sense. It is the pain that arrives in a life that did everything right. The question of why good people suffer keeps coming back. Not because no one has answered it, but because it never arrives as an abstract problem. It arrives as something personal, directed at one life, one loss, one moment where the equation stopped working. Not someone who walked away from what mattered, someone who showed up, who prayed when it was hard, who chose integrity in the moments where no one was watching, and dishonesty would have cost nothing. And still, the difficulty of suffering when you have been faithful, carries something that other suffering does not. When a person who has lived carelessly encounters consequences, there is at least a recognizable logic to it, a cause and an effect that, however painful, makes sense. But when someone who has given generously, stayed faithful through things that would have broken most people, and done the work of becoming someone worth trusting encounters something they did nothing to produce, the logic does not just bend, it breaks. And what breaks with it is sometimes the entire framework on which the faith was resting. I am not going to offer a clear theological explanation for why this happened. Anyone who moves to that answer too quickly is offering something too small for what the question actually is. What I want to talk about is what God sees when He looks at a good person going through something this hard. Not the reason. What is happening inside the suffering, and what it is producing that nothing easier could ever build. Maybe the suffering is not evidence that God forgot. Maybe it is evidence that He trusted this specific person with something this significant. And to understand what that means, we have to start with the real question underneath the theological one. The real question underneath the theological one. The question, why do good people suffer, is seldom actually about good people in general. It is about one person, and that person is usually the one asking. Most people who find themselves in this question are not looking for a theological framework. They are not researching suffering as a concept. They are sitting in something specific, something that has a shape and a weight and a cost they did not anticipate. And they are trying to reconcile what they are living through with what they believed about the God they have been faithfully following. And underneath the language of the question, there are usually three far more personal questions that are not being said out loud. Does God see what is happening to me right now? Not in the general omniscient sense. Does He see this specific thing on this specific day, at this specific cost? Does He care about what it is taking from me? Not just in principle. Does the weight of it register to Him the way it registers to the person carrying it? And if He sees and cares, why has He not moved? Why is this still happening to someone who has not stopped praying, has not stopped showing up, has not given God any reason to look the other way? Those are not questions that get resolved by a list of reasons. They require something more honest than a list. Psalm 88 is a prayer that most people who study Scripture know exists and quietly avoid. Every other lament psalm in the Bible eventually pivots. The writer moves through darkness towards something that resembles dawn. Gratitude surfaces. Trust reasserts itself. The arc bends toward light. Psalm 88 does not bend. I am overwhelmed with troubles, and my life draws near to death. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths, and it ends there. The final line of the psalm is not a declaration of trust. It is not a turn toward morning. It ends with the words, "Darkness is my closest friend." That is how the psalm ends, in the dark, with no resolution. What I find significant is not the darkness itself. It is that God included this psalm in Scripture. He did not edit it toward a more comfortable conclusion. He preserved a prayer that went up without coming back with an answer, and He placed it in the canon as if to say, this is a real place that real people actually live in, and I am present in it even when my presence cannot be felt. God is not threatened by the unresolved cry. He is not waiting for the question to become more theologically acceptable before He engages with it. He already put the darkest version of it in His own word, unanswered, and kept it there. That tells me something about how He holds the question when someone brings it to Him now. The question God is least threatened by is the one most people are most afraid to ask. He already preserved it, unresolved, unanswered, and permanent, which means the next question is not whether God can hold the darkness of what you are in. It is what He sees inside it that you cannot yet see from where you are standing. What suffering produces that nothing else can? Suffering does not produce depth in a person because pain is good. It produces depth because pain goes into places that comfort never reaches. I want to say that carefully because this is the point where it is easiest to slip into something that sounds like a justification for suffering. It is not that. The suffering was not good. What happened to you was not designed to be a lesson. And anyone who moves too quickly to the silver lining is usually protecting themselves from the discomfort of staying in the reality of what they are in. What I want to say is something more specific than that. There is a kind of presence a person develops that cannot be manufactured, cannot be studied into, and cannot be produced by any version of an easy life. It is the specific presence of someone who has been inside something dark, who did not come out of it quickly or cleanly, and who learned in the process what it actually feels like when someone stays rather than fixes. Most people, when they encounter someone else's pain, reach immediately for a solution, not because they do not care, because the discomfort of sitting with unresolved suffering is genuinely difficult to tolerate. The person who has carried their own unresolved suffering long enough has developed a different tolerance. They know how to stay in the room. They know how to be present without needing the other person to be further along than they are. They know how to hold silence without rushing to fill it with reassurances that are more about the person offering them than the person receiving them. That is not a small thing. The world has very few people who actually know how to do it. Isaiah 53 describes someone as familiar with pain, not acquainted with it, not aware of it from a respectful distance, familiar. The word carries the weight of something lived inside rather than observed from outside. The way you are familiar with the layout of a house you have lived in for years, you know where the weight falls. You know which rooms are harder. You know it not because you studied it, but because you inhabited it. A man of suffering and familiar with pain. What that familiarity produced was access, the specific capacity to reach into places in people that success and comfort and good theology simply cannot touch. The places that only open to someone who arrives and the other person immediately understands. This person has been here. They are not guessing at what this feels like. That access is not available any other way. What suffering produces in a good person who does not let it make them bitter is not simply endurance. It is the most specific and rare form of access to other human beings that exists. The person who suffered and came through without closing can walk into rooms that the unbroken version of them could never have entered. And what God sees in that person, from where he stands, is not what the suffering has taken. It is what the suffering has made possible. What God sees that the person suffering cannot. God is not looking at you in your suffering and seeing someone he forgot. He is looking at you and seeing someone he trusted with something specific. That is the thing I want to say most directly in this conversation. And I want to say it without softening it into something comfortable, because the honest version of it is more useful than the gentle version. When God looks at a good person going through something hard, he does not see the evidence of abandoned protection. He sees someone who has been entrusted with a weight that requires a very particular kind of person to carry. Not because suffering is a privilege dressed up as pain, but because the person who comes through something genuinely difficult without losing their character becomes something the world needs, in a way that the comfortable version of that same person simply cannot provide. God saw what you couldn't while you were inside it. He saw what the season was building while you were only able to see what it was taking. He saw the specific access it was creating to people and places that your life before this would not have been able to reach. He saw the version of you on the other side of this experience who would be able to walk into someone's darkest moment and say from a place of actual knowledge, not theological theory, "I have been here, and it did not finish me, and it will not finish you." That sentence, said by someone who has actually been there, carries a weight that no amount of education or good intention can replicate. The opening chapter of Job contains a detail that I keep returning to because of what it reveals about how God sees the people He allows to go through the hardest things. It was not the enemy who brought Job's name into the conversation first. It was God. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." God pointed to Job, which means God saw something specific in Job that made him the person this particular weight could be entrusted to. Not a test designed to break him and see what happened. A trust was placed in him because of what God already knew he was able to carry. That does not reduce the suffering. Job's pain was real, his loss was catastrophic, and his confusion was completely legitimate. None of that is minimized by this reading. But it means the suffering was not evidence that God had stopped paying attention. It was the evidence that God had been paying close enough attention to know exactly what Job could hold. God saw what Job couldn't see from inside the loss, that the man who came through this would carry something that the man who had never faced it was not yet able to carry. The suffering God allows in a good person is not evidence of his inattention. It may be the most specific evidence that he has been paying very close attention indeed. Which means the question shifts from why this happened to who you are becoming, because of what you chose to do inside it. Who the good person becomes through the suffering. The person who comes out of suffering without becoming bitter does not emerge with answers. They emerge with something the world needs far more than answers. Most people assume that the value of going through something hard is in what you learn from it. The insight, the lesson, the theological clarity that arrives on the other side. What I find to be truer and more difficult to articulate is that the real value is not what you know afterward. It is what you become. Specifically, it is the presence you are able to carry into rooms that the unbroken version of you could never have entered. The person who has suffered well does not fill silence with discomfort. They do not reach automatically for resolution when what someone actually needs is a witness. They have stopped being afraid of dark rooms because they lived in one long enough to learn that darkness is not the same as the end. And the world has a significant shortage of people who know how to stay in a dark room without immediately trying to turn the lights on. That person is rare, and they are rare specifically because there is no shortcut to becoming them. You stayed faithful when the logic of your faith stopped making sense. Most people do not do that. When a belief system stops producing the outcomes it promised, the most common response is to quietly revise it downward. You stayed in the question instead of leaving it. You did not become the bitterness that every legitimate circumstance that was offered to you. That required something specific, something that was not bypassed by the suffering, but was actually built inside it, in the specific conditions that only that kind of pain creates. You are still directing your questions toward God rather than toward the idea that God is not there. That particular orientation, maintained through something this difficult, is a form of faithfulness that does not develop any other way. 2 Corinthians 4:17 contains a word that most people read past because the surrounding language is so familiar. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Achieving. Not will eventually produce. Not will someday result in. Achieving. Present tense. Active. Ongoing. The trouble is not a context in which something good is happening elsewhere. The trouble itself is the mechanism. It is doing something right now, while it is still happening, before any outcome is visible, before anyone around you can see what is being produced. The weight of what is being built is greater than the weight of what is being carried. Not because the carrying is manageable, because what is being produced through it is that significant. The person who comes through this without losing what mattered most carries something into every room they enter that changes the temperature of it. That does not happen any other way. There is no alternative path to becoming that person. And what that means for how you carry what remains of this season is where this conversation comes to rest. Here is what I want to leave with you. Not a resolution and not a reason. Something more honest than either of those. I do not know the specific shape of what you have been through. I do not know what it cost, how long it has lasted, or what it has done to the framework you built your faith on. And I am not going to offer a clean explanation for it, because anything I offered would be too small for what the question actually holds. What I do believe, and what I hold with real conviction, is this: God was not absent from it, not causing it, but present in it, working in it, seeing from inside what you could not see from where you were standing, building something that only that specific experience, at that specific cost, was capable of producing. The suffering was not evidence that he forgot you. It may have been the evidence that he looked at you closely enough to know what you were able to carry, and then stayed with you while you carried it, in a way that does not always feel like presence while it is happening, but becomes unmistakable when you look back from the other side. The person who came through this without becoming what the suffering was trying to make them is not the same person who entered it. What was formed in there is the most real and durable version of you that has existed. That version carries something into the world that cannot be borrowed, performed, or produced any other way. If you are still in the middle of this right now, you do not need to have arrived anywhere to leave something in the comments. One sentence, or just the words still here, still asking, still standing. That is enough. This space is for honest people in unresolved places. Subscribe if this is the kind of conversation you need more of. Share this with someone going through something they did not deserve. Like this video if it found you at the right moment. There is more here for anyone still learning that God sees further into their suffering than they are currently able to see.